listening session. My name is Bishop Marcia Dinkins, and I am the founder of Black Women Rising and the lead for the Black Appalachian Coalition, which was launched on June 18th, 2021. BLAC was launched to address Black erasure, degenerative policymaking, and the need for the lived experiences and stories of Black people to be a catalyst, not just for infrastructure, but for human infrastructure, such as healthcare, affordability with prescription costs, childcare, good paying jobs, investment into Black-owned businesses, true workforce development that moves people not just to jobs, but into careers, entrepreneurship opportunities, and so much more. These listening sessions are being held to bring forth the lived experience and stories of Black voices in Appalachia that are often overlooked, exploited, extracted, and excluded from the decision-making table, and catch the brunt of degenerative policymaking, largely due to the public narrative that romanticizes the rule in Appalachian region as a monolithic white space. BLAC believes that in order to fix the problems of today, not only do we have to be the voices of today, but tomorrow and years to come. Today, we will hear stories from our speakers that speak to their lived experience. We will look at what types of investments are needed to improve the quality of life for Appalachians living in the region. Health, we'll look at the health and economy for Black people. We'll also identify ways we can work together to ensure federal funds reach the communities who carry the burden of divestment. And then we'll have time for Q&A. Joining us today is Akisha Townsend-Eaton. She is an attorney and community advocate. She has more than a decade of experience spearheading and advancing progressive local, state, federal, and international laws and policies. She currently serves as a managing attorney at the Animal Legal Defense Fund, where she works to implement the goals and strategic objectives of the nation's largest pro bono network for animal protection. She is an associate fellow for the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics and has authored a number of publications in the field of animal law. Outside of her work, she serves as the Economic Development and Environmental Justice Chair for her local NAACP. She is also a new member to the Wisdom Table and a contributor for the Black Appalachian Coalition. Thank you and welcome, Akisha. Our second guest is Shayna Goggins. Shayna is a community organizer for Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. Shayna is rooted in dispelling the negative perceptions or stereotypes held about the Appalachian culture, people, and region. Shayna's involvement with public, community, and political activities and/or organizations has been centered in social justice advocacy and diversity issues. She splits her time between serving in and with bodies that are comprised of students and professionals within the field of domestic violence, homelessness and housing, mental health, and higher education. In addition to serving with or in organizations that have addressed disparities within the Appalachian region or nation at large. Akisha and Shayna, welcome and thank you for being a part of this much needed conversation.
Thank you, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. So to get us started, I would like to extend the opportunity for both of you to share a little bit more about yourselves, your work and your experience being a Black woman living in an Appalachian region of Kentucky. Akisha, I'll ask you to go first, and then Shayna, feel free to pick up after Akisha.
Thank you, Bishop. I'm so excited to be here with everybody to share my story and to hear the stories of so many other folks in Kentucky. I consider myself, a policy nerd, but even for me, a term like infrastructure, it's hard not to think of it in a mechanical way that's, limited to engineering, roads and bridges and, distant from our day-to-day lives. So that's why I'm so glad that you've emphasized the importance of human infrastructure. And, you mentioned, to talk about, what my story was as a Black woman living in Appalachia. And, I'll start with saying that I am a millennial, and I've always heard stories passed down that shed light on my own family's Appalachian roots and contributions to Appalachian society, even Appalachian catchphrases from some of my older relatives, like over and down yonder. But it's interestingly enough, I always grew up thinking, I am, I live here, but I'm not necessarily, I don't consider myself an Appalachian because of those images, growing up of Appalachia. I felt growing up that I was here and that my family was rooted in the state, but that at the same time, we were on the periphery. Interestingly enough, I think that the only reference to Black Appalachians that I could remember growing up in popular culture was through the lyrics of My Old Kentucky Home, which talks about a slave story and used the term darkies to refer to Black people all the way up until 1986. So even when I was alive, we were still singing darkies. The darkies are gay in our official state song. But I'm so glad that that Black is here to invite these stories and to recognize the culture and contributions. And it's made me think of stories such as that of my great-great-grandmother, who went by the name of Mammy Callie. And, I remember hearing stories about her. She was a midwife who traveled by horseback. She was located in rural Tennessee, so also part of the Appalachian region. And what she did was she delivered both white and Black babies who didn't have the luxury of doctor-assisted birth. So that also touches on the fact that we live in close proximity and share the same struggles. And it just happened for her. She was one of the most well-regarded midwives in the regions, and white families needed her services out of necessity. But she was especially important to Black families who could really only be able to have access to the services of a Black midwife. Yet, if you were to do a Google search of midwives on horseback, you would not see one single image of a Black midwife during that time. When we go back to infrastructure, there's lessons to be carried from her experiences and so many other Black midwives' experiences to address the inequities that exist today in Black maternal health and health access in general. And there's, that's just one aspect of the contributions of Black Kentuckians and Black Appalachians to Appalachian culture. But really, contributions touch every facet of the culture, down from, providing these critical services to, the musical contributions. When you see Appalachian musicians, you would never guess that the downstroke of banjo picking actually was influenced by Black Appalachians. So I'm very, very glad to, start having these conversations and dig deeper, as you like to say.
Thank you so much. I'd like to pass it over to you, Shayna.
Very much in line with what Akisha has shared. I think that I was probably an adult before I realized that the place that I lived in was Appalachia, and that also I could embrace that aspect for myself. Akisha and I, our stories are very similar in that much of my family came into Kentucky via Tennessee. And at the time, the area that they came into was heavily entrenched in coal mining. And again, it wasn't until I was an adult that I learned that a great-great-grandfather was actually a coal miner. And I point those things out because we do have this notion and or this idea based on popular culture and media that Appalachians are all white. they're all rednecks, they're unsavory characters, they're biased, they're prejudiced, they're uneducated, they're misinformed. And I feel like to a certain degree, coming up as a child in an Appalachian community whose family had deep roots to Appalachia, these are things that we did not associate with. And therefore, we did not embrace that aspect of our identity. In that you could go to Pulaski County, Kentucky today, and you could ask my grandmother if she's an Appalachian, and she would tell you no. And she would tell you no based on all of those reasons that we have discussed and or we see every day, in that she does not want to be identified or remembered as an uneducated or misinformed person. And I think that is really what has driven me to do a lot of the things that I have done, in that we can be Black, you can be a person of color, you can be anything outside of the norm or the mainstream and also be Appalachian. I worked for a nonprofit organization that served a significant portion of the Appalachian region. And it's a joke, but it's also true, in that many days when I would go to those communities to do the work that I was tasked with doing, I was the only person that looked like me there. And one time I had an individual ask me if I lived in that particular community. And sometimes, as I do, I let my mouth respond before my brain catches up with what my mouth really should say. And I looked at this person and with the utmost sincerity and respect and said, don't you think it would be on the front page news if a Black family lived in this community? Now, it didn't land necessarily the way that I thought it was going to land, in that maybe they were just trying to publicly save face about me pointing out a thing that was very obvious, in that this particular community, the last known Black family that lived there, the local story is that he was literally run out of town. So again, they were well aware that people that looked like me did not live in that community. And I was a little younger and maybe a little more blunt than I am now. And I felt that that was important to point out, in that there are people that look like us that exist in these spaces. And if we don't exist in these spaces, there's a reason why we don't exist in these spaces. And so we go back to when we look at Appalachian communities, we do not see ourselves represented in that. There are many, many countless stories of contributions, not only from Black Kentuckians, but Black Appalachians in Kentucky. And the notion is that the victor always gets to tell the story, right? And we know many times in many communities where Black individuals have not been the victor and they have not had control of the narrative or the telling of their story. There are many things that I learned in the instruction of an introductory course I taught in Appalachian Studies at Eastern Kentucky University, in which I learned things about my own history. And then I learned things about my own family as a result of that. And I think that it's really a sad aspect of human nature, in that many individuals that look like Bishop Dinkins and Akisha and myself have been told you have to minimize these aspects of yourself in order to be able to fit in. I didn't realize how much of a rural Kentuckian I was until I went to a space in my first 2 years of college, and I was around other Black people that I was not related to. And many times I heard, oh, you're just talking white or you're acting white, in that I liked country music. Some of those local, sayings that we do about down yonder and things of that nature, people have always associated that with whiteness. And therefore, if I am doing those things or I am saying those things, then I am trying to embrace aspects that are not mine. Now at 17, I completely shied away from all of that and was like, no, I'm not trying to act white. I'm not trying to sound white. I'm just from the country. This is what we do. This is how we do things. And I didn't understand that those things could exist in the same space, in that I could be who I was and I could talk how I did. And I wasn't shunning any aspect of myself. And that Black people really helped build and shape the society and culture of Appalachia. And those are not the stories that we tell, because there's a lot of stigma associated with that. All to say that the fact that in my adulthood, I cannot be a part of all of the conversations that exist around Blackness in Appalachia, but I try my level best to be in all of them. And I try to initiate those conversations as well. When I was offered the opportunity to teach Appalachian studies, I thought for a moment, I can't do that. In that I understood that the majority of my students were going to be white, and that some of them would not necessarily appreciate a Black woman telling them about things that they have always been associated with, or things that people assume are theirs and not mine. So that took some personal reflection on my part, in that this is my history, this is my region, this is the impetus for why I do what it is that I do. And yes, on the outside, we are very different. However, if you had to make a list of things that all Appalachians appreciate and value, you would see that being Black does not exclude you from having some of those same values and or ethical or moral standings. And not to minimize that we need to pay attention to the differences, but we also need to understand and embrace the things that we have in common, in that race is a significant element to our life, no matter where you're at geographically. However, you can take those things and you can build upon them, and they can be strengths, and they do not have to be weaknesses. And everything that I do and strive to do is to illustrate to people that I can be Black and like this. I can be an Appalachian and like this. And that these two things can exist in the same space. And that I am absolutely 100% comfortable with it, because that is who I am. And if people choose to be not comfortable with it, they don't have to be around me. And that we no longer have to be in a position that we have to minimize ourselves to make someone else comfortable. And I think that's just a consistent theme that we've all seen across the course of our lives. Like Akisha said, you're not going to find a picture of her relative who was a midwife. You're most likely not going to find her name noted anywhere. So that's why it's critically important for us to have these types of conversations, and to collect these stories and to document these stories, because we cannot allow ourselves to be erased, in that so many other entities and groups will try their level best to make it seem as though we are not here and we have not had an impact. And we are tasked with the challenge of making sure that that does not happen.
Thank you. That is so powerfully said. One of the things that I think about is, and I share this story often, is, the inspiration was, that I often find is how Native Americans had the Native American Holocaust Museum, and it was Native American women who was able to grab back and take control of the narrative, not only verbally, but through writings, through imagery and things like that. And people don't realize the criticality of what's written about us, what is that's not even written by us, and then the imagery that continues to perpetuate the disconnect or the disassociation with where we live, and not even helping us to remain connected to the culture of our region. And so, Shayna, I am going to come back, ask you this, because one of the things that I learned about you is not only do you strongly identify as an Appalachian American with the positive attributes, but you also work vehemently to dispel the negative perceptions or stereotypes regarding the Appalachian culture, the people in the region. And, you mentioned, you and Akisha both mentioned, we don't hear the positive things, but what I'd like to ask you is if you could you and Akisha both could really kind of expound upon like the positive side of being Black and being, or a Black Appalachian, because we don't hear that. And I think, just to hear what you said about your grandmother, is that she's done some powerful things, but yet and still she doesn't identify because she has to disconnect from the narrative. And so part of that feels like raising the question is that purposely done? So that they can maintain control of the narrative. So if you could just, I'll ask you first, if you could just talk about some of the positive things that we don't hear about, and then those negative things that you really push against, with regards to the culture and the people and the region. And then Akisha, I'll ask you as well to take a few minutes to also expound upon it. Thank you.
I think for me, where my center is rooted in that generically across the board, Appalachians have an intense love of the land. And I think Akisha might have mentioned this, or we discussed aspects of this in our conversation before the session started, in that one, we don't hear enough about Black farmers or agriculture and our connectivity to the land. And, you think about that, the vast majority of us have had those experiences, in that most likely somewhere along your family tree, someone owned a farm or worked a farm or did things of that nature. So, one, in that all of the wonderful, beautiful things that we think about Kentucky, we think about agritourism, we think about agriculture, we think about just getting out and enjoying nature. Those are things that are not typically associated with Black people in Appalachia. And to pair that with your other portion in reference to the comment I made about my grandmother, yes, I 100% think it is a defense mechanism, if you will, in that if you consider that my grandmother was born and raised at about the time of Jim Crow and segregation, and then had my mother that at the end of the civil rights period, if you will, and then I came along not too long after that, many of the things that my grandmother does or shared with my mom and then inherently passed down to me was, you lessen aspects of your Blackness, in that maybe there are certain foods that you don't like and or enjoy because someone's going to associate that with some negative aspect. And really the best parts of Appalachia, I think, is our sense of community, in that there are more communities that are tied together to ensure that everyone has equal access and equitable access to the things that we need. But we don't hear that necessarily. We hear more about divides within community. One of the things that has been troublesome, but at the same time enlightening, if you consider the work that they're doing in Corbin, Kentucky with their Sundown Initiative. Just a brief history lesson in that about 1919, 1920, Black citizens in Corbin, Kentucky were literally run out of town. And again, going back to where we see communities where there are not folks like us, there's a reason. And so the citizens of Corbin, Kentucky have banded together and they're embracing that aspect, the negative aspect of the history, in order to bring about a positive initiative and a positive change. And I think we don't see enough of that. We don't hear enough of where white and Black communities or other members of diverse populations and or groups are working together to address issues, to provide services, to make sure that everyone feels like they are a part of that community. Because when you consider Appalachia, one of the things that we hear, and we hear it about the South in general, is that we are very friendly and we are very welcoming people. And we know that to a certain extent, but some of us have had experiences where we've gone into communities and we've not felt that. But then we've also gone into communities where there's been an overabundance of that. We see things on the news that just talk about areas in which we are deficient and areas that we are defunct. We don't hear enough about initiatives or programs or services or individuals that are within the Appalachian region that are working to make things better. So not necessarily that there's one stereotype or there's one negative image. I think one of the things that I really do is to illustrate and to demonstrate to people that you can be more than what someone assumes that you're going to be. And that if you think about your own experience, like for me, when I was in high school and coming up, nobody pegged me to be smart. Nobody pegged me to be an intellectual. That wasn't necessarily in my category, if you will. And part of that I bought into, and I let that stick with me for a long period of time. And, going back to the stereotype part, we make the assumption that African Americans, and particularly African American women, are not educated, when in actuality, not to, quote a number that I don't have committed to memory, but African American women are some of the most, if not the educated group of individuals in the United States. We don't hear about Black intellects. And I think in part, no one looks to us for that. No one looks to us to be revolutionaries. No one looks to the times throughout our history that we have been involved in social justice and advocacy. That thread runs common throughout. So really just reminding people that Black Appalachians and Appalachians in general are socially and civically minded. We care about what happens to one another, and we are not sitting here aimlessly waiting for someone to come in and fix us and someone to save us, and that there's nothing wrong with us. This may come up in the rest of our conversation, but we need to believe that we can fully be participants in society. And we also need society to understand that we have a right to fully participate in society. So, just showing up and being present, being in spaces that there are not people like you. Everyone assumes that you're going to be uncomfortable and that you're going to be intimidated. And so I think showing up in any and every place in which there's a conversation about Appalachia, there's a conversation about women, there's a conversation about Blackness, that works to dispel stereotypes, because people assume we don't want to be a part of those conversations when we're just simply not asked.
That is so powerful. We lost Akisha, so hopefully we get her back, but we'll continue. And that's one of the things, we're not asked, and so I heard you mention, about social justice and advocacy. And I know, being one who has worked in social justice and advocacy myself, that a lot of the things that we fight for is the rights for those who don't have the rights, who are impacted, as I said earlier, by the degenerative policy making, or who are fighting for land and land rights and land use and for agricultural reasons, or dispelling the stories around, the coal miners, and not acknowledging, the Black lung disease with the coal miners, and they were Black coal miners. But I'd like to ask you, as a community organizer, what are some of the things or some of the issues that you see that you need to, fight strongly for? I know living in a small community, a lot of times there's like the lack of access to hospitals or healthcare or physicians. And especially when COVID came, a lot of physicians were leaving because they just couldn't, they couldn't make it. And then not to mention our seniors who, they have Medicare and Medicaid as a subsidy, but still they cannot afford, prescriptions, and then the lack of internet. Can you just share, like, what is and I know that you've worked in some of these other areas around homelessness and housing and domestic violence, but speak to some of those things, because one of the things that we do know is that when change occurs in these spaces, we need what? We need policies on the local, state, and national level.
Absolutely. I think, we have been having this long-standing conversation in the Commonwealth about homelessness. And yes, homelessness does impact individuals differently in an urban area as opposed to a rural area, but it's homelessness all of the same. So how do we address that? I think that we do a good job of trying to provide services, but I don't think we pay attention to all of the intricacies in that, right? In that we say the devil's in the details. So when you're looking at providing services, I think you need to be aware of the unique circumstances and variables that that individual brings to the table. Public housing is not as accessible in rural communities. Then you also take into consideration that you still have individuals that hold on to bigoted, discriminatory, and or biased beliefs about members of various groups. So if, for example, you have a woman of color who's experiencing homelessness in a rural community where that type of mentality exists, housing might be available to her, but you can't necessarily put that person in that housing, and that you're not sure, what they're then going to be subjected to. So for me, what I think is helpful is that we have to take away the stigma that's associated with the terms racial justice and equity, in that for some reason we have this idea that these are dirty words, they're curse words, if you will. And we have been too long focused on providing access or rights to one group takes away from another. Why not just adding access and rights to one group improves the situation for the entire population? In that, if you take a look at Appalachia and you take at our overall health, we are extremely unhealthy people. And then you can break those down and you can look at the various population demographics in terms of race and age, geography, and you can sort that out yourself. So, what is it that makes us unhealthy? What is it that we need to be healthy? And I can speak specifically from the standpoint of a mental health practitioner, in that clients of color that I have, one of the things that they have expressed to me is they want a therapist that looks like them. We're not saying that other therapists who are not African American or people of color are not competent or capable. It's just that there are things that people that are in that respective group, they want to be able to talk about it with someone who looks like them, in that there's some familiarity between us. You and I are from different places, but most likely we've encountered racism. We've dealt with bigotry. We've dealt with some form of ism or discrimination. And it's completely different to process that with a person who is not a person of color. So when we talk about infrastructure, and if we look specifically just at healthcare, one of the common themes is what's the affordability, as you mentioned, Bishop Dinkins, and that, people, fortunately, we do have expanded Medicaid in the Commonwealth. However, that doesn't mean that we have that many practitioners that are competent and capable of providing those services. So we have to address economic disparities and how we provide access to individuals based on their socioeconomic status. We've also got to make sure that those individuals are trained and competent. Cultural awareness brings about a whole new lens when you consider that culture is significantly influenced by where you live and the experiences that you have with the people around you. Then you throw in other things like sexual orientation or identity, as well as racial or ethnic identity. So we can have all of the services in the world, but if they are not uniquely expressly designed for each individual that might encounter that system, it's pointless. It's just like having individuals that work within the area of the court system that are misinformed about options or services that are available to domestic violence victims. In that, if you take into consideration that a person of color may seek out medical attention or services and they're going to encounter someone that is different from them, that might be a barrier, in that every experience they've had with a white professional to that point might have been unsavory or not as they preferred. So that person is then going to be resistant. They're not going to feel comfortable disclosing everything that they need. And so then again, you're not working to address the issues that individual is facing. Not saying that having Black doctors, Black nurses, Black therapists fixes it, in that one, we know that there's a shortage of that. It's about accessibility. It's about making sure that you do everything that you can to provide representation, so that everyone, if you will, can have equal access to what they need, but also access in the way that they need it to be. And I feel like there's a piece of your question I might be missing. So please tell me if I didn't answer everything that you wanted me to.
No, you answered it. I just mentioned about, and you spoke from it, from your place of a practitioner, in the mental health, and one thing that I think about when you talk about that and you talk about the access and homelessness, I think they forget to attach the mental health aspect to it, because mental health is attributed, or there are so many things that is attributed to mental health that we just often, slip under the rug, because it goes back to a word you mentioned earlier, stigma. When everything is stigmatized or politicized, we tend to step back. And we know that Black health has been weaponized in so many different ways, which is why we see, attacks on reproductive liberation, or, people being able to get medical care, like where I live at. If the physicians, if you go to specific hospitals and the hospital feels as though what you are coming to the hospital for, if it goes against their religious beliefs, that they cannot treat you. And so we know where those disparities are going to take place. And then we don't look at the fact that all of these things contribute to mental health, and those things contribute to, the population of homelessness or increased homelessness. And then it pits, things. And I can appreciate you mentioning how, there's this pitting of one thing against the other, in the place of building up. So yeah, I do. I thank you so much. I see we have Akisha back. Welcome back, Akisha.
Thank you. I'm sorry for that technical difficulty there.
That's okay. We have a double portion of you. We see two pictures, but we don't mind. So double portions are great.
Sure.
We were talking about mental health, and we were Shayna was definitely just letting us, reminding us of how many ways, people don't have access to certain things, and because they don't have access, how it still, continues to diminish their quality of life. And part of it can just be having somebody who looks like you, who can understand the plight that you've gone through, and that presents a form of cultural humility as well as sensitivity. And I think we forget about that. And then what's attached to that, a lot of people don't understand that. And we talk about climate and environment for one thing, and we know that climate and environmental hazards often result in climate migration, people having to leave their homes, or in the alternative, having to adapt to a community that was already struggling, to a community that is struggling even more deeply. And I know you had shared with us, a story around Louisiana, and some work that you had to do as a result, that you started working on as a result of what happened in Louisiana. And one thing that we talked about is how attached people can be, and we don't think about these things, all of these other things that impact our lives, how people can be attached to their animals, or to their pets, I should say. I want to be very respectful, because they look at their pets as family, and that may be the only family that they have. And so when we have incidents of climate, impact, or environmental impact, and they're, said that they have to leave, they don't. And so I'd like for you to just expound upon that, and what you've seen as a result of that, how it has impacted, Black people in these communities, and, the importance of, even thoughts around that specific need for legislation or infrastructure, when people are asked, to evacuate or to leave. And we know Kentucky has had a lot of flooding going on here lately.
Sure, thank you for that. I know we're discussing that, and you're absolutely right. And I'm sure Shayna has just discussed the importance of mental health and being able to see people who share your experience, who look like you. Um, Interestingly enough, I am one of now I believe 2 full-time attorneys in the United States that are practicing animal law on a full-time basis. There are many others of us in community that work on these issues as part of the practice, but not full-time. And I have the privilege of working on, a big part of our role in the pro bono program is to connect folks who might not otherwise be able to afford or have access to legal representation to help with everyday issues regarding animals. And a lot of times we have folks that are living in, impoverished situations, anecdotally, a lot of people of color who say, I can't really talk about this issue in the Black community because people might be offended that I think so highly of my animal. But especially in terms of folks who live alone, you're right. I mean, that might be the only connection that they have to any sense of well-being is their animal. And we had, prior to me becoming an attorney in this field, Hurricane Katrina, which an untold story there. Hundreds of people, countless people lost their lives trying to get out of their homes and evacuate. And we saw the images of the copters pulling people off of roofs and, doing these extraordinary rescues. But what wasn't shared widely was that a lot of people lost their lives because there was no provision for them to evacuate with their animals. They were told that they could get on the boat, but they would have to leave their animals behind. Now, some did and are facing trauma to this day for those, really in their minds, family members that were lost, and others stayed behind with their animals and they drowned together. And because of that, because of the loss of Black lives, in a big sense, the PETS Act was passed, which is it's an Evacuation and Transportation Standards Act. It's a federal bill that now requires communities to put those plans into place, to have some type of plan that will accommodate the evacuation of both people and animals, in those situations. So that's definitely an untold story. And in my view, even though I'm focusing on animal protection, I can see every day how animals are really an essential part of the human infrastructure of the Black community. Such a significant number of Black community members have companion animals. I think nationally for everybody, it's around 2/3, but there is a significant number of folks that have animals as family members. And on the pro bono side, we also hear of stories where maybe someone hasn't been able to access important human services, other human services, whether it be, maybe somebody needs to go into the hospital, for example, and there's not really a place for them to have their animals taken care of. Maybe it's a discrimination issue, maybe it's a fair housing issue, and a landlord might be using an animal as cover for discrimination. So those are the types of things that come up in the context of, what is it to have a strong human infrastructure? So I'm glad to bring those issues to light. And we, also work on issues impacting all the species. So then we have, factory farming is another big issue. Of course, the animals experience untold atrocities in factory farms, but a lot of times these farming operations threaten communities of color through air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution. Then you've got the workers who are there who don't have the protection, as we've seen through this pandemic, that are predominantly people of color, a lot of times, even Black immigrants. There are several places in the Appalachian region that are, in the most severe threat zone of the impacts of these farms. So those are just, two of the many issues that I think intersect with this conversation in this line of work.
And just to point out quickly that when Akisha talks about factory or, factory farming, mass production like that, my family actually has a connection to a story like that in a Southern community in which the placement of a large scale farming operation significantly impacted the value of the land that they had and pretty much forced the sale, or is forcing the sale of property, and at a drastically significantly lower value than what this actual property should be valued at. And that who wants to live next to a factory that has that large scale of an operation? So, it all intersects and it all ties. When we talk about social justice and equity, we're also talking about these aspects that Akisha has mentioned, the economic aspects. In that, I strongly believe that the number of individuals that are Black that live in rural communities has significantly been impacted and altered by illegal or improper sales of property, the devaluation of property in terms of value, and then also placing things that are not as desirable within communities where people of color live. So whether we know we are doing this intentionally or not, we are then perpetuating and continuing to increase disparities in that we have few options as to where we can live. And that where you live is significantly influenced by economics. So again, all of these things go hand in hand.
You are absolutely right. And the first thing that comes to my mind is just the continuation of the harm and the trauma and the divestment, and the extraction and the exploitation and the exclusion of Black people due to the U.S. slave trade that people really want to slide under the rug. And so we still see these things today, redlining, that continues to just perpetuate, exacerbate, and elongate the harm that Black people experience, as well as when we think of, when we go to the, redistricting, how we are also, redistricted out of certain places, because they don't see us as a political lever as much as they see a political lever with the narrative around rural or Appalachian being white, which continues to, again, take away the necessary and needed resources for the healing of Black people on so many different levels. And so, Akisha, you had mentioned, I think we need to unpack this a little more with you and Shayna. You said, you mentioned about a strong human infrastructure. And so what I'd like to kind of unpack is two things. What does it mean for us to have a strong infrastructure? What does that look like? And then what type of investment is needed for us to have that strong infrastructure? And so Keisha, I'll let you go. And then Shayna, you can, by all means, just pick up. Just let's have this conversation. Let's take the suitcase and take those rocks out and put them where they may.
Yes, thank you so much, Bishop, and Shayna for sharing that story. Sometimes, these issues are very, very close to home, and having those out in the open informs what we need to do next to tackle this. And as someone, I guess as a millennial, I actually have a lot of hope, around these issues, because things can be done. I think that we're really good at our efforts to get out the vote. So, we're mobilizing around elections. We're inviting folks to share, what their platforms are going to be and how they're going to serve our communities. But what I think we could be a lot better at is building resiliency and strengthening our human infrastructure and taking those values that Shayna mentioned about community and saying, okay, how can we elevate our values in the public space in a way that shapes public policy that serves the needs that we have. And that means coming to the table. It means monitoring local issues. One of the things that, I appreciate about Shayna's organization, KFTC, is they have a process called deep canvassing, which I'm really excited to engage in, basically going door to door into communities and saying, we understand that because there is not a solid infrastructure for you to actually get to the table in the public policy making sphere. So maybe, the meeting is at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but you have to work until 8. So your voice isn't going to be heard. So we're going to take note of that. What's important to you? And this is the way that we're going to make sure that this is heard in the place that it matters. I'm a real big advocate for submitting public comments and attending those public hearings. There are many success stories of detrimental activities that have been prevented in communities that have banded together and made their voices heard, because oftentimes people don't expect you to show up, right? Our voices haven't mattered historically. We have not been invited to the table to share the story. And there have been few published examples of how that's worked, but I'm very encouraged that by getting in touch with local processes, by sharing the story through this venue. So we've had an opportunity for folks who are listening in to be able to write down whatever is important to them. I know that we're talking about the federal infrastructure bill. The White House has a platform for folks to share stories there. And, a lot of times those vehicles aren't really used. You have federal policies that are being made that are inviting public comment, and there's not one public comment on a lot of these. And public comments and public engagement does matter. As one example that touches my life very personally, we were having a conversation on student loan debt and the public service federal loan forgiveness program. There was a public comment period, and over 40,000 people submitted comments that have now led to the overhaul of that program. So I might be eligible to receive the forgiveness even faster, so that I can continue to do the work that I do. Without that program, I would not be able to be in this position. So that was just because people made their voices heard. And I think that there's so many examples to go along with that, from the smallest levels of decisions to the largest ones.
One of the models, if you will, that I used in teaching the course in Appalachian Studies is that much of Appalachia has been impacted by colonialism. Colonialism in the notion that an outside entity came in and took advantage or utilized the resources in the region for their express gain. Now, when we talk about resources, we're not just talking about natural resources, but we're talking about human resources. And so, the significance and importance of this conversation is that we need to have an expanded definition of what infrastructure is. We're not just talking about structures, and we're not talking about roadways. We're talking about human capacity. So much of what we need to do is to find a way to marry these idealistic ideas or notions that we have and make those into real-time opportunities. One of the biggest elements of mobility is providing people with options. in that, yes, from my standpoint, education is significant and important. And in order to do the things that I wanted to do, I did have to go beyond, and get a college degree. However, there are many individuals that don't have those same types of aspirations. So what options are we offering people? This might be an unpopular opinion, but I don't really appreciate that we provide many children with limited options, in that there is this notion that if you are a fantastic athlete, then that's your key to mobility. That's not necessarily the end all be all key to mobility, because humans inherently, our bodies break down. So we need to make sure that when we are looking at opportunities and we're looking at mobility, we are providing people with a variety of options, and not just saying that this option exists, but actually having a plan, a solid, tangible plan for how a person can gain access and or entry or fully participate in whatever that option is. We need to consider the human capacity and what do human beings need in order to thrive and be productive. And those things are very unique and they're very different. They're based on whatever group you are a member of, and they are significantly impacted by where you physically are at that point in time. We need to make sure that all of the things that we put down on paper that seem really good, that there's an actual practical application of that. You can craft the greatest policy that you possibly could. You could vet that with a number of agencies and organizations, but if that community does not possess the ability to execute that plan, it's pointless. It's just a really nice policy that looks good in other places. So are we looking at the things that we have in common? Are we looking at those things that are vastly different? And are we considering how to blend all of those things together? Because opportunity means something different to every unique individual. But we seem to have this cookie cutter approach that if this works for this group in this urban area, then this is what's going to work in this for this all groups in rural areas. And not to politicize this or to lend one side to the other, but I think that's the significance and importance of Charles Booker's campaign. If you just look at it philosophically and ideologically, he is making us or challenging us to draw this connection from the hood to the holler, in that we are all Kentuckians. And things that impact individuals in Louisville also impact individuals in Pikeville, but in a very different way. So are we looking at those things across the board? Also to mention that just having the conversations, many times conversations are shut down. We've all heard it, in that someone wants to say, oh, you're just playing the race card. No, I am playing the card that is in my hand. And race significantly impacts whatever it is that I'm going to do. We cannot deny that. We have to absolutely be aware of that. We also have to take into consideration that when a person makes a conversation or a statement that, yes, they've gone here to do this and they've gone here to do that, that they did not feel welcome and they did not feel comfortable, we need to know why. Because even though it is 2021 and many things have changed since 1975 when I came along, we have a tremendous amount of work to do, in that we still have white spaces and we still have Black spaces. And we are creating situations and communities in which, if you are in a predominantly white space, you have better resources. But if you are in a predominantly Black space, your resources are inadequate at best. So we have to really acknowledge that we are still making decisions based on race. We are still unconsciously or consciously deciding who gets what based on what they look like and where they live. And we know that we need to center ourselves in racial justice and equity. We also need to understand that bringing one group up does not push another group down. And I think that for Black Kentuckians, we need to be comfortable with that, in that everybody was all abuzz whenever we started making the statement Black Lives Matter. Well, Akisha and I have given two examples at least in which that movement has always existed. In that my great great grandfather, Sam Goggins, he cared about Black lives as a Black man, but he didn't have that movement. So the notion that the Black Lives Movement is new, it's kind of a fallacy in that every single individual in this community has cared about Black lives. Historically, we can point to movements in which Black lives have mattered. So why is that so difficult? Why is that so unsavory to say? We're not saying that we matter more, we are saying that we matter. And in part of saying that we matter, we have to look at, yes, I live in Kentucky, but I also live in this community. And I also look like this, and I also interact with people that look like this. So we can look at our unique individual experiences in order to inform what we need across the board.
Thank you for that. You said a whole lot of delicious things, you and Akisha, Shayna. And one of the things that I just want to harvest from the conversation, from what both of you unpacked, is the fact that we have to be a part of not only the policy part of it, but the implementation and understanding. And I think that's something that's never raised in conversations, is the understanding of what might work for your community may not work for this community. And it brought me to this, when there was this rural, in this rural community where they needed a hospital. And so basically they had to look at what could the community really afford? While you may have wanted this big lavish hospital, it would have weakened the economic system for the community. And so I think a lot of times we don't think about, and thank you for just reiterating, Shayna and Akisha, is that we have to look at the dynamics of the community and the fact of who needs what, and the ways that they can have mobility. But I also appreciate how you brought forth, a lot of times we talk about mobility and people just see it, just from, a single lens view of they're thinking transportation, but we need economic mobility. We need that mobility means I get to have access. That mobility means I get to walk on my own land and I get to own my own land. It is those things that allow us to move about in our lives in a way that we are living a quality of life that we deserve. We're not, people are not asking for anything that they don't deserve. And despite popular rumor out here, Black people just don't want the hand up or the handout. It is really that, as you said, if you put this card in my hand, that's the only card that I get to work with. And so if the only card that you put in my hand is the thing that you constructed to make privilege work for you and to create this narrative or continue this narrative around white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism, then if the R card is the only card that I have, then I have to use that card to the best of my ability, because the only way we get to real true racial justice is when we arrive at economic justice. And so we need that mobility right there. And so in these last few minutes, because I'd like to open it up for questions and answers, is, understanding again that the federal government, we know they're going to eventually, these dollars are going to come into the community. How do we bring the people together? Because Black would like to work with individuals in Kentucky, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth. Akisha is a part of, the coalition, the table. How do we build this table to ensure that even though we have the R card in our hand, that's in our left hand, but in the right hand, we have the E card, which is saying we need this equity in our community and we need it coming to us. And we need not only a plan and a set of processes. Inside of the conversation, we need implementation. And how do we do that? I'd like to really think through, how do we do this? Because the conversation is not just, I say often, it is not just a today conversation. When we talk about what we're talking about today, it's connected to long-termism or legacy. Because what we're saying is, number one, we have a legacy and it has to be brought forth. And this legacy, in order for our children, because I'll be honest, I have grandchildren. And the scariest thing for me is what's going on today around the discourse with CRT and all of that, about how little bitty steps that are taken and the leaves are crunched out loud, that is slowly but surely moving our voices out, so that by the time it gets to my grandchildren, they don't even think that they have a Black identity or see, where there's Black visibility, because as you said, the one who has, who has the power of the card is the one who's telling the story. And so it's critical, it's viable that not only do we tell the story, we have to tell it in such a way and keep it and archive it and do what we need to do so that our children or our grandchildren or my great-grandchildren are not erased. And I see you, Akisha, please, by all means.
Sure. I am so glad that you brought up the concern about your grandchildren, especially because we started this conversation with erasure of Black voices and experiences. And how do we prevent that from continuing to happen? And you mentioned critical race theory. Well, it's all over the news. We've got 2 bills that have been pre-filed in Kentucky that they don't mention critical race theory by name, but the idea is to prohibit these types of conversations. In fact, this very video that we're doing right now would probably not be allowed to be shown to students if these bills were to pass. If they pass, it threatens everything we've just talked about from being talked about in a public education setting. So I think that paying attention to that, there's a lot of movement around those particular bills, but it is something that is concerning to me. I mean, they go as far as possibly a lot of people think about, okay, well, we're not going to be able to share history. So a lot of critics will say, I'm not concerned about things I don't believe, or I don't acknowledge systemic racism. Why can't we just focus on Dr. King's message of I have a dream? Well, under these pieces of legislation, even what Dr. King wrote would not be allowed in a classroom. We couldn't no longer look at Letter from a Birmingham Jail. We couldn't talk about his experiences coming to Kentucky and, the role that he had. He visited Kentucky many times in his career. And one of those times was related to a protest of the Kentucky Derby, which was, as our most heralded tradition for many people in the state. And there was going to be a disruption over the lack of fair housing opportunities in Louisville. And the National Guard was sent in, the Ku Klux Klan came in their full regalia to preserve law and order. And what does that remind me of? It reminds me of, all of the uprising we had around the death of Breonna Taylor, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and the protests there and the strife there and people coming in to bring law and order. We could not have those conversations in the context of history or present day events. We're talking about restricting conversations about the federal infrastructure bill as it applies to impact on race, racial aspects of it. And to me, I mean, it's more insidious than restricting conversation on something that people might not find a favorable topic to discuss. It's depriving all of our children, not just our Black children, but all of our children, of a fundamental right to education, to be citizens that are able to solve problems and to uplift and to protect and to serve their communities in all levels. So I think that is definitely such a valid and timely concern to have. And in terms of building community, I think it's so important to have forums like these, to have people who are in the trenches, like Shayna, who are doing this important work to advance policies, communicating with people who will never find themselves at that table, but maybe you'll find them at the doorstep. Maybe they won't relate to an issue about a crumbling bridge, right? It's important to people who travel across that bridge. Maybe it's unsightly to people, and they're finally, grateful for, a bridge that hopefully won't collapse when they're driving across it. But when we were talking about, and I was listening to the earlier listening session, when a pastor was talking about I-64 in West Virginia, which I've traveled many times, and the history of, kind of separating communities and tying in with redlining and impacting, Black communities in a way that disrupts economic stability, also environmental justice issues, when you've got so much traffic coming across the bridge, and the particulate matter that comes along with that, and breathing that in and day out. So, when you talk about bridges, one of the issues that came up in my community was, okay, we're repairing this, but what's going to happen to the lead? It's covered with lead, right? So that might not be on someone's mind, but the more that we can connect with each other and share the multiple impacts, and the ripple effects, because that lead could go into the waterways. As burdened as our water systems are, it could create another problem. So are there mitigation methods to address that issue in a way that we can talk about it through an environmental justice lens? So I'm so glad that we're considering all of these angles, since they're so important.
And just to throw in there quickly, that part of this, going back to what Akisha said a moment ago, not just organizations like my own, Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, but many organizations, in that for the longest time, we have perpetuated this idea that the balance of power is held in the hands of white males. And so, to a good degree, the conversation is focused on the things that overwhelmingly impact that segment of the population. And a conversation can only center around the ideas or topics that the participants bring to the table. So we need to be involved more in these conversations, in that if we make up a good number in terms of the population, then we need to have representatives that are representative of us. We need to have Black and brown people sitting at the tables, informing policy decisions, and also adding these critical components and aspects, in that we all have privilege to some degree. And that privilege can either allow us to have a broader picture of what other individuals may need, or it can limit our view, and we can only be focused on what directly impacts us. So we need to encourage people to become a part of the process, whether it's running for office or just simply attending city council meetings or any decision-making body in their community, in that people will have a very difficult time making decisions if you are there bringing issues to the table that also need to be considered. Just like Akisha said, I think about infrastructure and I think about bridges, I think about the repair of it, but I don't think about those other aspects that she mentioned. And that, what do we do with those discarded materials? Where do they go? We look at our overall environmental health, and then you look at where people live. And for example, in my home community, many, many, many women of color I know have had some type of either uterine cancer or breast cancer. Is that environmental? Is that genetics? Is that their lack of adequate health care? Is that some resistance or hesitancy on the part of Black women to seek medical health? Who knows? But if people are not comfortable about having those conversations, then I'm going to continue to see the number of Black women I know be disproportionately impacted by cancer. So again, all of these conversations are important, but these conversations are not going to happen if we're not there and we don't see it as our place to be there.
You hit the nail right on the head. And it made me think about, and like you said, with Akisha bringing to the forefront all of the other things that happen, and lead is a major, major issue. I know in Ohio, and we had a major issue of lead, and we look at what happened in Flint and what's still happening, and now what's happening, I think, in Benton Harbor, Michigan, where they can't drink the water. And I don't, who would have ever thought that, some aspects of construction is putting things in the atmosphere that are so unhealthy. And when I think about, lead in our children, how Black children suffer, high rates of lead within their system, and not people don't know, for every 5 deciliters of lead in a child's system, they lose an IQ point. And our children are being diagnosed with ADD and ADHD when in fact it may be lead. But because we don't have access to test, WIC used to do it. They don't do it anymore. A lot of the federal government programs have stopped doing it. Medicaid will do it for a specific amount of time for a specific age. But again, we don't know that because we're not told that, and dare not ask a private insurer if you are privileged, if you have health insurance, because they don't want to do it. And so our children grow up, and pregnant women as well, because it's in the windows, it's all of that. And people think, oh, it's the paint chips. The truth of the matter is, it isn't. These children are too smart to eat paint chips. It's in the soil. It's in the air. It's in the windows that we lift up. It's in the buildings that we walk into. It is in all of those areas where we have not looked at what are some of the ways that we clean up in a very meaningful and healthful way. And as you said, Shayna, we can have these illnesses, but because there are so many factors, and it's not just one, there are so many factors that keep us in a point of having strong rates of maternal mortality, infant mortality, loss of life, or I wish we had time, but when we have our whole roundtable, Melanie Mead from Ohio from Pennsylvania, talked about how where she lives at, there was a report generated, I think in 2019, that talked about the reduced mortality rate for women. And so it's about like educating ourselves. It's not that we need white saviorism, because we don't need white people to come in and tell us what we need and how we need to do it. It is about just what you both said, having the conversation and bringing these voices to the table. And I so appreciate the both of you for having such powerful voices today at this table. And the goal is to continue to fill this table up with more and more and more seats, so that we are telling the story about us, by us, and for us, for our health, for our longevity. We are breaking down and dismantling the imagery that continues to make us look like, we're problematic, when we're problem solvers, we're credible messengers, we're warriors. I mean, anytime that you can still deliver a baby in the field and get up and pick cotton, and I'm going to put a punctuation point there called a period, because we don't even have to discuss it anymore, or you can go around and deliver babies. We have to break down some of these normalized things, such as interest convergence and normativity that continues to be barriers, for us. And so what I'd like to do is, if we have any questions from the listeners, we would like to, give a few minutes for you to ask any questions or to make any comments that you may have, ask of Akisha or Shayna, or just make a comment yourself. Okay, so it looks like we don't have any questions in the chat. So you all did a phenomenal job. We can begin to wrap up. I want to thank you both again, Shayna and Akisha, for joining us in this conversation and for helping to advance such a powerful conversation and educating everyone, especially me, on so many levels, and bringing forth the reality that even we have more in common than we do differences. And even if we do have differences, they are in such small ways. So what I'd like to do is to give each one of you an opportunity to just give some closing remarks. And we will, we'll close it out after that. So if you could take about 2 minutes of closing remarks.
Thank you. Can you all hear me? And I apologize for the technical difficulties on my end, which I'm sure we could have a whole other conversation on the need in our infrastructure talks for reliable and accessible broadband internet. But thank you so much for the opportunity. I am very honored to be able to bring my experience and story to the table. And I would just encourage anyone who's listening now or in the future who's listening to this or any of the other listening sessions to take advantage of the opportunity to share their stories as well. Because I think that when we're all at the table physically or virtually, whatever format we are, we're all building upon each other's work and coming up with innovative approaches and affirming one another in our experiences. I know this conversation has inspired me in a number of ways to be a better listener and advocate. And I hope it's been a valuable experience for others. And I just, would like to thank you for the opportunity once again.
Thank you. I did not, and I would apologize because there is a Q&A section at the bottom of your screen after participants. If you have a question and answer, you could put it there. We do have a question for you, Shayna, before we close out, and it's from Mr. Savory. And he says, Shayna, you mentioned high incidence of cancer among your friends. Are there particular environmental hazards in your community that you're aware of?
I don't think we know per se, like specifically what those environmental hazards would be. Many of those individuals that I mentioned, they lived in a general area. So it could be what we've talked about in that what types of hazards and or chemicals have leached into the ground and then impacted drinking water and things of that level. Two people that come to mind, they did live in an area in which there was a lot of construction. So if you consider that maybe some of those materials were not disposed of properly, we have to give some notion to the state of the land when people decided to move there and or build houses. So, when we dig in the dirt, what types of things are we stirring up into the air or the atmosphere? So specifically, no. I think locally people have some suspicions that it might be tied to factories or other chemicals that are, in the atmosphere and or the environment. It's just that when you look at this group of people that predominantly live in one area, and they all had some form of cancer, and you're looking at women specifically, one starts to kind of draw their own conclusions. And kind of speculate as to what that is. And I think part of this goes to what are the types of questions that people are asking about their health states? What are the things that we know about that we might potentially be exposing ourselves to? So, it's just a myriad of questions that need to be answered. But all too well, in my particular experience and in my community, it is the general notion that Black people don't ask a lot of questions. I'm the opposite of that, and that sometimes I ask too many questions, which might be problematic because I want to know why, who, when, and how. But there are many people that don't ask those questions, in that part of getting an answer to a question often leaves you with the notion that you have the power to change things. But if you're not in a position to change where you live, you may not necessarily want to know all of the hazards that you're being exposed to because you don't have any options. Um, it is something that I keep mentioning to people, like, hey, maybe, we need to consider an environmental study, or, what is it that's going on, and that why are Black women in this area being impacted by cancer so significantly? What do we bring to the table? And then what's in the environment around us? So I just want to thank you guys for offering up this space to have this conversation. Any and all conversations about Appalachia and about Blackness, I'm here for it. You can get my contact information. And to point out Frank's comment, a friend gave me that sugar box, and it sits on my cabinet. And we use Blackbird as a nickname for my daughter because I really like that Beatles song. So anything that relates to a blackbird, I kind of picked up. So thank you.
Thank you both
And if
again.
I can,
Mhm.
oh, I'm sorry. I can't see you all, but I can hear you all, and I think I heard the question too. And I just wanted to add for the person who asked the last question. So this is a tool that I only recently learned about, but for, if you're interested in learning about particular pollutants in your own community, the Kentucky Energy and Environmental Cabinet has an environmental justice environmental data map where you can actually put in your zip code. It will list who is, emitting certain pollutants and what those chemicals are, and where they're concentrated in my community. All of the reportable data happens to be in the highest in the community with the highest concentration of Black residents and people of color. So that's an interesting tool that might be worth considering. I'm not sure if that was the question, or where, if you're in Kentucky and where, but it is in the Kentucky Energy and Environment Cabinet's website.
Thank you for that. So again, I want to thank you both. We will continue this conversation. I will be calling on you again. Shayna and Akisha, if you want to put your contact information in the chat, please do so, just in case people have additional questions where they would like to be able to reach out to you. I want to thank our audience members for attending this discussion today. I truly hope that you were able to glean and harvest something from it, because we know Dr. Frank Walker is in the audience. I just want to put him on notice. We will be reaching out to you to have a deeper conversation around that term that you developed, Appalachia, and what brought you to that point of really, birthing and building out that term Appalachia some time ago. I want to thank you again. And if you would like to get involved with the Black Appalachian Coalition, you can go to our website, which is blackappalachiancoalition.com, which you'll find the link to that in the chat box. And you can go and you can hit the get involved box. We have a lot of things that we need people to be involved with, because this is something that we have to build out for us and with us. You can also like and follow us on our YouTube page, which is the Black Appalachian Coalition. We ask that you subscribe and like it so that we may, I see Shayna bringing out a book, so that you may be able to get subscriptions or be put on notice when we have other events coming forth. We also have a Twitter page and a Facebook page, and those links you can also find in our chat box. I want to thank Orvie, Joanne Kilgore, and Ben Hunkler for all of the technical and logistical support that they have given. Without their support, it would not happen. We also want to lift up, come on, Shayna, put that book up there. What is the name of your book?
Saying this book, Appalachia, by Dr.
Okay.
Walker. Not the least bit intimidating that he was in the audience today, not at all.
Well, he has a book, and I just encourage everyone to get that book. I also want to remind everyone that on October 28th, we will have our 4th listening session. It will be with Ohioans. And on October 18th, we will have a book read and book discussion with Dr. William Turner. He co-authored Black in Appalachia. And on October 1st, he released his new book, Harlan Renaissance. And this book really speaks to the stories of Black life in Appalachian coal towns. So we will definitely have a really good discussion for that. It's from 12 to 1:30. So get your lunch and just sit and join us, for that discussion. You'll have an opportunity to order the book and to just hear more. So again, I want to thank everyone, for joining us today. I hope that you are taking away a whole lot of food, good food, and it has come to a point where it has excited you and enticed you to join the fight, so that the Black erasure of Black people does not happen, but that we are building a community. We are building our cities. We are building a nation where all people are included, not just some people, because the one thing that we know, it takes all of us, not just some of us. So again, thank you for joining this conversation. Shayna, Akisha, thank you for just lending your wonderfully powerful voices. And I just wish everyone a good rest of the day. And tomorrow's Friday, so I'm also wishing you a great weekend. Take care and talk later, everyone. And if you want to just look at this again, this is on YouTube. And so if you'd like to just look at it again, and it did something and you said, I've got to hear it again, you can go to the Black Appalachian Coalition YouTube page and it will be there. Again, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining and have a great rest of the day. Bye.